Ghost of Tsushima is a game that has been said a lot about since its initial PlayStation-only release 4 years ago in 2020. I will try my best not to rehash too many opinions that have been said during that time, though perhaps a lot of them are just that valid when it comes to this title. I am, at this point in my life, a PC-only gamer. This is not necessarily by choice, so I don't have any irrational hatred towards console-exclusive titles or anything, and I feel more a languid sadness towards the inability of playing those games at release when I do think they're interesting enough to warrant playing them at release. Thankfully, the general sentiment towards exclusives like this seem to have shifted more towards timed exclusives, with most modern blockbuster PlayStation exclusive games like the Spider-Man titles, the modern God of War games, the new Ratchet & Clank, the recent Final Fantasy titles, and, of course, Ghost of Tsushima all making their way to PC, eventually. I am all for this policy of releasing a game for console first and then start working on a PC port later down the line, provided the port is of sufficient quality, of course. And as far as I could tell, the PC port for Ghost of Tsushima is a very decent one. Sure, there's some degree of bugginess and glitchery, but nothing too out of the ordinary, and the few times it did crash for me, it was back to back and more than likely related to my video driver not being updated, as doing that did fix the crashing at least. I am also glad that the game ran surprisingly smoothly on my PC. For the most part, considering I'm still rocking a 6-year-old CPU and GPU at this point. The actual game itself then is essentially what you might call a minimalist open world game. It's not on the same level as something like Assassin's Creed Odyssey, where the map is absolutely showered in icons everywhere you go, but it still has a fair amount of similarities to those games. In general, these similarities are all very positive ones though, and calling Ghost of Tsushima a good or fun version of those Ubisoft-style open-world games is a valid statement, I feel. The game itself is still very large though, with 3 distinct areas to explore in the base game and an entire secondary island as added optional content, which you can start from Act 2 onwards, but is generally a better idea to start after the main story has finished on Tsushima itself. I'm currently around 45 hours in as of making this video and still haven't finished everything there is to do in a single playthrough, with an entire multiplayer focused game mode present here as well, which I've barely touched so far. In Ghost of Tsushima, you play as the Ghost of Tsushima. Or rather, you play as the person who will come to embody a nigh mythical figure which will be called the Ghost. Tsushima is an island between Korea and mainland Japan, which has historically seen it as an important trading hub. In the setting of the game, however, in the late 13th century, it is also the ideal staging ground for an invasion of mainland Japan by the Mongol Empire. Tsushima was therefore the first target of this invasion at large, and historically everything largely lines up. There was a clash at Komoda Beach, which is the intro of the game. The Japanese were extremely outnumbered and subsequently defeated, but the similarities end where the game begins. You play as Jin Sakai, samurai lord and vassal under Lord Shimura, your uncle, who is the Jito of the island, or lord of the island itself. You fight bravely during the initial invasion, but get mortally wounded while your uncle gets captured by the leader of the invasion, Khotun Khan. In-game, this is all as frenetic as it sounds, as it puts you in right at the initial battle. You wake up a while later after the battle, having been cared for and healed, and go look for your weapons and armor. Here you meet Yuna, the woman who saved you, hoping you could help her save her brother, who was similarly captured by the Mongols. As you sneak through this town, you learn the basics of stealth, staying out of sight, moving across the rooftops, with Jin quickly realizing Yuna knowing how to handle herself this way, brands her as a thief, putting her in opposition to the law and order these samurai represent, which is a major theme of the game's story. once you find your blade, you get a flashback which functions as a combat tutorial and some character building of both Jin and Lord Shimura. After this tutorial, you start facing off against some real enemies, and Jin really starts embodying this ideal of the samurai by saving as many people as he can along the way. You eventually manage to find some samurai horses, with which Jin rides all the way to Kaneda Castle, the major stronghold on the land bridge connecting the island's two halves. This bastion is where Khotun Khan is holding Shimura prisoner, and through a desperate charge through the front gate, you manage to actually come face to face with the Khan himself. You are simply no match for him at this point, however, and you eventually fall to what should have been your second death, yet once again narrowly escaping its clutches. As things stand, you can hardly face the Mongol horde all on your own, so you set out to find allies and promise Yuna to help rescue her brother, who is a blacksmith, in return for their help figuring out a way to assault the castle later down the line, which will eventually result in you getting a grappling hook to work with. Then the title drops. In one of the best title drop scenes I've seen in a long while in a video game, and the entire world opens up to you. You get a map, you can explore however much you want, with 2 tales or quests functioning as guidance in case you don't know what to do. And that's it. Try to save your homeland and what's left of your family, fight back against the Mongol invasion, and free the island of Tsushima through any means necessary. That's it for game premise and a quick rundown of the intro/tutorial of the game. And as you have no doubt already seen for yourself, this game is absolutely drop-dead gorgeous. Ghost of Tsushima is genuinely one of the most beautiful games I have ever played. I have no clue how all of these PlayStation exclusive titles manage to do this so consistently, but this one is utterly gorgeous. Climbing a shrine at sunset or sunrise, riding through tranquil forests on horseback, leaves playing in the wind, rays of sunshine beaming through the canopy, animals darting around. Just on that front alone, this game is absolutely stunning. Though you might get accustomed to this over time, of course. But then you enter the second area, which is visually very distinct from the first, trading in the rocky forests and waterfalls for swamplands and more flat terrain in general, with the third area then being covered in snow instead. And Iki Island, the optional secondary island from the DLC, having its own flair of nature and open flower fields and the like, which is still distinct from the first area. The game definitely keeps things visually fresh. This also applies to the combat, with generous spattering of blood on every strike, sparks flying when steel meets steel, and a great variety of finisher animations as well. The Heavenly Strike special move, for example, usually results in dismemberment on a kill with a wind blast following it, which is pretty amazing to see. So in general, the game is beautiful. No doubt about it, but this also applies to the general UI, by which I mean that there is very little of it. When you ride around out of combat, there isn't even any UI to speak of. You don't have a minimap, no radar, no compass, no nothing. So how do you even know where to go without looking at your map constantly? The wind. The wind is your guide throughout the entire game, and this is an absolutely ingenious way to do this. This makes guiding you to your objective something diegetic, something that makes sense in the game world itself, with the wind being an embodiment of your father's spirit, and it also gives the island of Tsushima some character itself, which get reinforced even further by animals serving as your guide as well. Golden birds lure you to points of interests and activities. A green firefly pops up to guide you to artifacts and records to collect, provided you're wearing the traveler's attire. Smoke plumes in the distance lead you to points of interest. At fox dens, a fox will guide you to a shrine of Inari, which you can honor to improve your charms. In case you don't figure this out for yourself, there's a lot of NPCs that will mention this to you as well, making it all make sense within the game and just making the island of Tsushima itself a character in itself. Very cool. All in all, very impressive visually across the board. Even in combat, the UI stays very minimalistic. Sure, you have your own health bar and resolve meter, which are crucial, and an indicator to show in which stance you are, which is also crucial, but that's about it, really. Dangerous enemy attacks will glint red if you need to dodge them, and blue if you can parry them, but even enemy health bars don't show up until they're one hit away from death. The game shows you what you need to know and when you need to know it, which is actually quite refreshing in an open world game like this. So the game is visually very impressive when it comes to nature, the wind, the weather, stuff like that, especially the weather. Thunderstorms are absolutely great to see as well, with the clouds rolling in and stuff, absolutely beautiful. But it does lack in one aspect: facial animations. I played with the Japanese voices enabled, which is something you can do at the start, and the lip syncing was just bad for the most part. I think it's just the facial movements not being accentuated enough or something, but this stood out as the one visual aspect that was lesser than the rest. Now, the funny thing with the game looking this good overall and this minimalistic is that the few pre-rendered cutscenes which are made in the game engine just look worse than the actual game itself because of the compression of the video and whatnot. That's just for the in-engine cutscenes though. The ones you get for the Mythic Tales, for example, are very different as they are painted, which is very cool and brings these tales alive in their own way. But like I said, an extremely impressive game on the visual front, and that's without the black and white filter to stylize it to old samurai movies, or the photo mode, which I didn't even touch for the longest time, because the game, as is, just looks so good. Aside from the visuals, the sound is also impeccable, as far as I can tell. The sounds of nature are amazing, with a bunch of ambient sounds that make it sound like you're actually traveling through a forest or a marsh or whatever, with trees creaking in the wind, far-off animal sounds, birds chirping, woodpeckers doing their thing, the wind rustling through the leaves and trees. Your armor also makes its own sounds, as do your footsteps depending on the material you walk on, which is always very cool to see in any game. If you pay attention, you can even hear bells of certain collectible items jingling in the wind on top of a cliff or whatever. Playing the game with the sound on definitely enhances the experience as a whole. Combat also sounds very good, with good feedback for you and your enemy's actions. Enemy archers will shout out before they fire, which is a very cool detail I don't think I've seen in a game like this before, with the other enemies ducking out of the way of the actual arrows. The early assassinations you do before you upgrade your tanto to make them quicker are very gruesome with the sounds, hearing bones snap and stuff like that, with the later ones being a lot more elegant, so to speak. The music in general is also very good. Nothing stood out to me as extremely special or anything, but it just sounds like good early Middle Ages sounding Japanese music. It reminds me of Shogun 2 Total War, for example. To me, it all sounds very authentic overall, from sound effects to music all around, so it complements the visuals very nicely on that front, and technically the game is very well put together, I think. The gameplay itself is largely divided into two parts, combat and exploration, though for the most part they intermingle very well. Clearing out a Mongol camp is a bit of both, for example. In any case, let's take a look at both aspects of the gameplay separately, starting with combat. Combat itself starts out fairly simple, on both you and your enemy's end. The foundation of combat is very straightforward. You have a light attack which is quick and best used for dealing damage, a heavy attack which is slower and is best used for building stagger, a block and a parry which is best used for attacks that are parryable, and a dodge which is best used for dodging heavy enemy attacks and projectiles. The best way to handle these options gets taught to you in the tutorial and intro of the game. Break an opponent's stagger with heavy attacks and then use light attacks to kill them. Parry attacks to expose an enemy and kill them with light attacks, or dodge an enemy to expose them and kill them with, you guessed it, light attacks. At the start of the game, enemies are relatively weak and stagger in 2 or 3 heavy attacks, regardless of which enemy type they are. There are a bunch of enemy types in general to go around. There's swordsmen, shield bearers, spearmen, brutes, archers, and their own variations here and there, with more special swordsmen like rogue Ronin samurai, or dual-wielding swordsmen, or spearmen with shields. You get the idea. As you progress through the early game and encounter Mongol leaders, you start building towards learning new stances, which are extremely effective against one of the 4 main melee enemy types. The starting stone stance is effective against swordsmen, with you then unlocking, in order, the water stance for shields, the wind stance for spears, and the moon stance for brutes. As your enemies get stronger, they get more HP, more stagger resistance to non-stance heavy attacks, and deal more damage. They also gain heavier armor, such as helmets, so they aren't as vulnerable to headshots from archery fire from yourself. Towards Act 3, it is very difficult to defeat a shield bearer in anything but the water stance. It's still possible, but it's just a lot more difficult. And spearmen especially are very annoying to fight without the wind stance and a specific perk within that stance that parries their attacks while doing your heavy attacks. As a rule of thumb, all light attacks do the same damage against all enemies, but it's really the heavy attacks and their stagger buildup that determine how well you can fight against a specific enemy type. I was a big fan of the water stance charged heavy attack combo Deluge, which breaks shield bearer stagger and also deals a good amount of damage after that as well. A very cool animation and very cool to kill them with the last strike of that combo. Personally, I really liked the evolution of the combat system here, starting out this simple and then expanding and evolving over time. It makes sense in the universe as well, as Jin keeps improving and adapting to his enemies. This also gets reflected very nicely in the ghost weapons and the evolving tactics part of your skill tree. While stance dancing in combat is actually a lot of fun, it does get marred quite significantly thanks to one single controller-specific issue. The right trigger on the controller is the do everything button. You use it to talk to people, to pick stuff up, to use your grappling hook, etc. But in combat, you hold right trigger to bring up the stance and quick throw weapon selection. You can then change your stance with the face buttons and the throw weapon with the D-pad. Sounds good, right? This all works fine until the moment either an enemy dies and has something you can pick up on his corpse, or something else in range is pick-upable with the right trigger. In this case, you pick the item up without bringing the stance menu up and slowing time during it. This feels like such a strange design overview because it is relatively common for something to be interactable like this while fighting, with me then wanting to switch to stone stance for example and accidentally jumping instead. This completely ruins the flow of combat. usually results in you getting hit anyways and you not being in the stance you wanted to be in to fight the enemy you're currently facing. On mouse and keyboard, it's just 1 through 4 you push to switch stances, no big deal. This was for me the singular most annoying part of the combat gameplay as a whole playing on my Xbox One controller. And the solution for this is simple, right? Either let me rebind my controller myself or just put the stance menu on any other button that doesn't get used in combat, like a D-pad button or something. Or make it so that you pick the item up and still go to the stance menu anyways. But usually it took a few seconds after picking an item up to even be able to get back into the stance menu as well. All of this really brought down this very interesting aspect of the combat, as the stance dancing is one of the most crucial parts in combat to do, with enemies on Iki Island even switching weapons themselves. So you have to adapt your stance to a single enemy multiple times instead of the general overview of, oh, there's 5 spearmen here, so I just have to be in wind stance. In the base game, it just feels like an oversight to me. Another issue I had with the combat is more personal and essentially boils down to min-maxing. You have an armor set and a bunch of charms you can equip, with each giving you various bonuses to certain game aspects. You have a charm that essentially doubles specific resources you find, an armor set that massively buffs your archery, with charms that do the same, like restoring ammo and concentration with headshots. There's armor that buffs stealth, or standoffs, or melee damage and health, or just traveling around, revealing more fog and making finding artifacts easier. This is all fine, of course. Most of the more powerful legendary armor sets are tied to mythic tales of legendary warriors, which is cool. Same with the legendary moves you can learn, like the Heavenly Strike, all being connected to the Samurai of Legend on Tsushima itself. But you can change your gear mid-combat. This means that I could run around in Traveler's attire, see a camp, change to stealth gear, kill a few enemies, go out in open combat, change to melee gear, pick a few enemies off in ranged gear, clear the camp, Traveler's gear, find a patrol, standoff gear, any survivors, melee gear. This is a possibility, not a necessity to be clear, but it was something I felt in the back of my mind nagging at me when I wasn't wearing Traveler's gear while traveling or combat gear while combating. I eventually played most of the game with traveling gear, changing to melee gear for some bigger missions like the assault on some Mongol strongholds, and when I got the ghost armor I just settled on using that, seeing as the ghost stance is very powerful, though sadly not upgradable in any way, and using it more than once in a single fight felt cheap and almost repetitive, as the kill animations were always the exact same, it looked like to me, which was kind of a disappointment because the ghost stance ties into the fear aspect and the slaughtering stuff, so I more expected more gruesome kills, I guess. In any case, I played on the almost hardest difficulty, and I never felt the need to switch to combat specific gear for the vast majority of the game, aside from a few duels, which are essentially boss fights, especially the one at the end of Act 1. So it's mainly the psychological aspect at play here for me, but it would have been nice to maybe get the ability to combine some armor perks when they're fully upgraded or something. Stealth is also a big part of the game and part of the combat, even if a lot of characters tell you off because of it. But you do unlock a bunch of ghost weapons, as the legend of the ghost continues to grow as you complete tales and free settlements from Mongol occupation. You get cool tools such as smoke bombs, regular bombs, sticky bombs, bell chimes to lure enemies with and whatnot, but I never really used this as much as just the regular sword and bow. The option is here for stealth, which is great, but it never felt as fluid or as good as stealth in an Assassin's Creed game, with the few mandatory stealth tales there are being the least fun ones in my opinion. Usually I'd rather do a standoff than try to pick off enemies one by one, but I guess that's personal preference for you. In general though, barring the few issues I had with the combat overall felt very good, and especially very visceral. They didn't skimp out on blood effects here, and it goes to show how brutal this invasion can be just on the combat front. After 40 hours of gameplay, I did start to feel a bit tired of the combat in general though, until Iki Island starts introducing a few more unique enemies, as its foundation is so simple. Once you get the hang of the stance dancing and parrying and dodging, it can become a bit samey after a while. But that is after quite a long while, so overall I was very satisfied with the combat in the game here. Exploration then is the second major gameplay pillar, with you riding around the island on your trusty horse, seeing the sights and exploring the land. Exploration is done very diegetically, as I mentioned before, with the wind being your main guiding hand and animals playing a big role too. You might be on your way to a new tale and get sidetracked by a golden bird luring you away to any number of side content, ranging from a simple pickup of a Pillar of Honor sword set to a relaxing bath at a hot springs or sharpening your resolve at a bamboo strike. They also show you the way to less obvious stuff like collectible hats in the environment or lead you to other tales as well. As you ride across the land, you will steadily reveal the map. Clearing out a Mongol encampment also reveals a wide area around it, and if you manage to fully liberate an area, the entire map gets revealed, showing you the last few points of interest you might have missed. While going from point A to point B, you often encounter random events, like peasants getting captured by Mongols, bandits or traitor Ronin, which can result in a quick fight if you choose to engage with it, and a small reward of supplies and a little bit of legend. A slight annoyance here is that, in the case that it is a captured peasant you need to free, is that these little freeing cutscenes are unskippable. This is no real big deal, but they start getting annoying after having seen and heard the same ones 40 times. Same thing with having to free hostages in camps, by the way. Cutscenes in general are also unskippable when it comes to tales and the story in general and whatnot, but these do become skippable in New Game Plus, supposedly, so I'm fine with it if it's handled that way, as the cutscenes are overall very cinematic to look at anyways. Exploration in general mainly rewards you with more resources which you need to upgrade your weapons and gear. There's shrines to climb, which function as a sort of platforming challenge, though the only real challenge is noticing which way the game wants you to go. These shrines then grant you a major charm after completing them, with most of these major charms having game-changing effects you can build your playstyle around, like wind chimes killing the person they pick up or making perfect parries and dodges easier. You then also gain one guaranteed piece of waxwood you need to upgrade your bows to the highest level. Inari shrines upgrade your charm capacity at first, and then provide you with a charm itself that gets upgraded after doing even more Inari shrines, which is nice. And this system also gets used more on Iki Island. There's also bamboo strikes to raise your resolve, hot springs which raise your maximum health, haiku locations that give you a headband, and eventually even duels that tie into a legendary armor set in Act 2. These activities and collectibles are nice and do fill in the open world, but as the case with essentially all open world games, focusing too hard on going through all of this optional content as fast as possible can be to the detriment of your enjoyment of finding these. Iki Island then also adds animal sanctuaries, which has its own little minigame, and archery challenges, which are so hard to get gold on that I had to switch to my mouse to aim with. The overall awe and fun feeling of the game does start to wane after a while, of course. The first 10 hours are great, but then after that, a little bit less so. This is a fact of life for essentially all games like this, of course. The less new stuff gets thrown at you, the more you feel like having to do something to get an upgrade or whatever, the less fun it becomes, for me at least. This also ties in with the general issue of when to do side content and when to do main content. The first area of the game has a bunch of points of interest you simply can't do anything at until you free your uncle from the castle. This is no big deal, of course, but it goes to show that the balance between doing side content and progressing the story is a fickle one at best. What is again very cool to see here is the level of detail and lack of hand-holding to stuff here in general. Whenever you liberate a settlement from Mongol occupation, you get this little cutscene that shows people moving back in, which then provides some new NPCs that can have rumors to ask about, revealing new locations on the map. And it just helps in general to make the island feel alive and actually make it feel like you're freeing the people from this Mongol occupation. When having to track a trail or something, you have to actually track the trail, with the wind guiding you back to it if you stray too far from it, but it's not like you get samurai vision or anything like that you might have come to expect in games like this. No Witcher senses or eagle vision or cyber vision or anything like that here. And I think that this is a large part of what makes this game feel so fresh, even though it is at its core very much like a modern Assassin's Creed or Witcher-like open world game. The minimalism of the UI, the general feeling of the combat, the viciousness of it all, it feels real and raw. The pure natural beauty of it all, paired with the great sound design, makes the game feel alive. And on a gameplay front, it still has the collectible stuff and whatnot you still want from a gameplay perspective, but put in a very diegetic way, which helps tremendously. For all of the collectible stuff like the haikus, hot springs, fox dens, shrines, everything, there will be one or more NPCs who you can talk to who will mention them. Oh, Inari is my guardian deity because my mother saw a fox the day I was born, so I'll go and honor the shrines. A bamboo strike is a great way to train your swordsmanship, even for me still, etc, etc. It makes the whole thing feel a lot less like a checklist and more of a list of things you want to do. You want to honor the gods and the island to become stronger. You want to relax in a hot spring or write a haiku to give Jin some reprieve. And all of it also ties in very well with the local Japanese culture, with which these games feel like a true love letter to this era of Japan, considering it was developed by Sucker Punch of all studios, the ones behind Infamous and Sly Cooper. And the amazing thing is, everything you do changes stuff in the world. If you burn down a logging camp, that logging camp will be, in fact, burnt down and stay that way through the entire game, as opposed to, say, Assassin's Creed Odyssey, where the same compounds you cleared will just fill back in with enemies, but maybe it's Spartans this time instead of Athenians. All of this to say that Ghost of Tsushima really makes you feel like a lone samurai fighting to free his land from Mongol occupation. Which isn't to say all of this stuff can't still feel a bit too samey after a while, of course. It all depends on how you perceive it, how you engage with it, and whether or not you play more loosely or go do 10 fox dens in a row and get sick of seeing that guy's smug little face. Before we get into the actual story, I'll quickly go over Legends mode, which is the multiplayer aspect of the game for which you, of course, need a PlayStation Network login. This alone gave me a lot of grief, having to troubleshoot some stuff, but I got it working eventually. The multiplayer doesn't seem to be that populated for every game mode that there is available here. It looks interesting, though. It essentially divides up the combat from the normal game into 4 separate classes. Samurai is a melee tank, Shinobi is more stealth focused, the Hunter has a ranged advantage, and the Ronin is more of a melee support. The multiplayer as a whole seems very well developed for what is essentially, in the eyes of many players according to the charts, and of course to my own thoughts, a throwaway gimmick tacked onto a single player game. There's almost as much Legends storyteller locations in the main game as there are enemy camps to clear, all just to remind you that it exists and to tempt you to leave the main game to go play it instead. Within Legends mode then, you need to grind out levels and gear to unlock new classes and difficulties and, perform better of course, which is fine as is. But assuming that most people will try this stuff out after finishing the main game, which can take anywhere from 10 to 50 hours depending on how much optional stuff you do and all of that, just to be met with more of what is largely the same combat, I can imagine most people are fairly burnt out on it by then. I certainly was. It does try to spice things up though, with special enemies like linked enemies who have to be killed quickly after the other or else they'll revive in these story modes. There's a PvP mode which makes it a competition to annoy your enemies and try to kill Mongols faster than them, and a wave-based defense mode and stuff. Don't get me wrong, from what I've seen from the different multiplayer modes and what I've played so far myself and all of the systems I've seen so far, it looks very good, it looks very well developed, even if it is largely based on RNG and grinding. But I'm not gonna spend another 20 plus hours doing this after just having played 50 plus hours in single player, with at least another 10 needed for New Game Plus if I ever want to get 100% on the achievements, which would also require a bunch of multiplayer achievements to be done, which I personally despise the fucking shit out of. Games that are sold 95% on the single player experience and gameplay with a tacked on multiplayer aspect, which then has achievements tied to that, I hate it. I despise it. It makes me sick. Tomb Raider also has those, I believe. You know, that game from 2013 whose multiplayer servers probably don't even work anymore, and if they do, have like 10 people in them if you're lucky. Amazing, great, epic. I'm definitely going to grind out 20 different fucking achievements for multiplayer alone here. Fucking shit ass, live service, bullshit cancer infecting everything, man. Fuck. The multiplayer here is a cool addition. It does bring some fresh stuff to the game itself, even if it's not the focus of the game, but it definitely should have had bots as an option, in my opinion. There's enough allies in the game that help you with combat. You can revive and stuff anyways in the main story, so just add bots and I'm happy with it. To finish things off then, we'll take a quick look at the story and my thoughts on it. There will be spoilers here, by the way. I already went over the setup and the intro, so let's pick up where we left off, with Jin Sakai being a lone samurai bent on revenge. There are a few different tiers of story, I would say. You have the main story, which progresses the main plot of first freeing your uncle and after that killing the Khan, but there's also tales related to other characters, which comprise an entire storyline in 9 or less of these tales that focus on those characters themselves and what is happening with them during this invasion. In Act 1, these are Sensei Ishikawa, a teacher of the Way of the Bow, whose latest student has gone rogue, and Lady Masako, the matriarch of a samurai clan whose entire family got killed in a plot that came to fruition just as the invasion began. You help these two in tracking and killing whatever they want you to, with Ishikawa also giving you a bow, unlocking archery in the game, and Masako giving you a samurai armor set, perfect to replace the one that got broken during the battle on Komoda Beach. These character-focused tale storylines are nice and interesting, as they are mostly intertwined with the ongoing situation and have their own problems and personal stuff going on, though it usually boils down to getting revenge on someone or other, building characters along the way when it comes to their thoughts on honor, battle, forgiveness, cruelty, and everything else that is related to this brutal war and personal story going on around them. There's also regular generic tales, which would be the lowest tier, which are all fairly short and sweet. Some of them take less than 10 minutes to complete, which give you some legend and crafting resources and some charms usually, with those rewards also being visible on the map before you even start with the tale, which is a nice touch. In general, these are also about people who suffer during this invasion. Some betray their own family and get extra betrayed after that, or just get their shit stolen by some bandits. There's one of those generic tales that stood out to me in Act 2 because it was a reference to The Witcher 3. This one begins with a peasant woman asking you to track a kappa, a demonic folklore creature you might have heard of, which are relatively similar to a drowner. and you follow the tracks left near the water, which don't look entirely human. So, maybe it's a real Kappa, you know? You then track them to a bandit camp. Turns out it was bandits all along, and then Jin and the peasant woman talk about how humans are the real monsters. I almost expected Jin to say something about a lesser evil, a monetary reward, or say something like winds howling. The main story then also mainly focuses on the invasion of the Mongols. Of course, it's almost like it's the central driving force behind the entire game or something. This part of the story also starts mainly focusing on the ghost part, with Yuna, the woman who saved you at the start, planting the seed of Jin being some sort of vengeful samurai spirit come to free the island in its time of need. Once you free Lord Shimura, the story starts to pivot more towards the necessity of honor above anything else. Samurai rule through honor, not fear or brutality, which is in essence what the Ghost is all about. Striking fear into the hearts of the Mongols by brutally slaughtering them, with this crystallizing into the Ghost's stance later. The duality and the conflict of samurai honor and Ghost's efficiency is what starts driving a wedge between Jin and Lord Shimura. During the assault on Castle Shimura, we can see the danger this code of samurai honor poses when pitted against the sheer ruthlessness of the Mongols themselves. Dozens of samurai get killed by them blowing up this bridge, and Shimura's response is basically saying, yeah, we're gonna do it again. Jin, on the other hand, focuses more on the lives of his people and saving them at all costs, including sacrificing his own honor. Eventually, Jin manages to sneak into the stronghold and poison the Mongols' drinks, absolutely massacring them doing this. This is a major turning point, as Lord Shimura now completely loses faith that his near-adopted son has any honor left to be redeemed by. The story then continues with Jin escaping north, going to kill the Khan with his allies and the people who started following the Ghost over the samurai themselves, also trying to somewhat redeem himself, as the Mongols now start using the same poison against the people of Tsushima themselves. This eventually ends in the Khan being killed, of course, by Jin and Shimura working together, and Jin and Shimura inevitably facing off against each other, as Jin is now branded a threat and outlaw by the shogun himself. Shimura, as the arm of the law that has to enforce the will of the shogun, has no choice but to follow orders and follow his own honor, which then ensues into this very cool duel at the end of the game, which isn't exactly an easy one either, by the way. But after however many retries you need, you triumph over your uncle and are presented with the choice to end or spare his life. I spared him. While they obviously have their differences, they're still family, and I don't think the Ghost killing the Lord of the Island would make things go any smoother for anyone, really. He then lets you go, and you continue on as the Ghost of Tsushima, working in the shadows to bring light back to the still Mongol-infested island of Tsushima. Overall, I thought the story was actually pretty good, pitting these moral codes against each other and seeing the fine line between honor and death and all of that good stuff was pretty nice to go through. What I didn't really like that much was the lack of player agency in these pivotal choices Jin makes. You get told off multiple times that a samurai faces his enemy head-on and whatever by Lord Shimura himself after you free him, as well as by other characters like Sensei Ishikawa in his tales, but this gets said even if you haven't assassinated a single Mongol aside from the one you need to progress a tale. This is like getting punished for something you just didn't do, which felt a bit strange as I very much so focused on the samurai aspect of combat a lot more than the shinobi aspect. The big turning point with the poisoning is also all out of your hands. There's no option to agree with Shimura to try another head-on assault or anything, you just have to do it because that's where the story is going. Which is fine, but if it clashes against how you as a player feel and act about it, it can tug at that feeling that it's not in your hands, which made the story as a whole less impactful, especially because there are moments where you can choose what Jin says, though I guess in essence they mostly boil down to the same thing most of the time. I was still satisfied with the way the story was going though, but I more wish I had a say in the stuff that led up to it. It really makes you feel like the Ghost of Tsushima, even if you don't necessarily want to. And finally, starting in Act 2, Iki Island also becomes available, which is essentially a big DLC island that got added later to the game, intended largely as post-game content. Going there warns you that the enemies here are tough, and they're right. And you'll also be stuck here for a bit in any case. Iki Island itself feels more nature-oriented overall. Aside from yet another beautiful incarnation of flower fields and forests, there's also animal sanctuaries and whatnot. The story here, then, focuses on the Eagle, the leader of a separate Mongol tribe from the main game, sporting fanatic shamans who buff enemies around them. This new enemy type is therefore extremely high priority to kill first, as normal enemies become extremely hard to kill while a shaman is buffing them. Another addition to the enemy roster, which I've mentioned before, is those weapon switching enemies. These additions to the combat definitely breathe new life into the combat itself, which was getting a bit samey at this point, like, I've already mentioned before. I also think a new Brute variant gets added here, with the same moveset as Khotun Khan with his glaive doing those spinny moves, which are very annoying fucking moves. A lot of cool stuff gets added or improved upon in this DLC area. You unlock certain charms that get upgraded the more you do their related activities. The base game has just one of these, and you need to clear like 20 fox dens before you even get it in the first place, while the archery and animal sanctuary charms you get at the start and upgrade as you go, which is a lot nicer. In general, it feels like a genuinely interesting addition to the rest of the game, with the story here focusing on Jin's past and the guilt he feels about the death of his father. This then ties in with the Eagle and her mind-altering poison, and Jin having to come to terms with himself and his past and stuff like that. There's also some cool horse stuff you unlock here, like a charge attack, horse armor and saddlebags, which can be very handy in the base game itself as well. So it might be actually worth it going through this area a bit earlier to get some of these perks unlocked before returning to Tsushima. So overall, a pretty cool experience and DLC in general, and it comes added with the Steam edition you buy by default anyways, so it's all good. In conclusion then, I really liked Ghost of Tsushima. I can definitely see the reasons why it received the praise it did during its initial release, as it definitely breathes some fresh air into the stagnant pit that is modern day open world games, or Ubisoft games if you prefer. This makes the upcoming Assassin's Creed Shadows infinitely funnier, of course. Even ignoring the whole Yasuke Twitter drama and whatever, I sincerely doubt it can live up to the beauty, simplicity and sincerity that Ghost of Tsushima has when it comes to this era of Japanese history and the beauty of its nature and culture. It really feels like a love letter to the era, the culture, the nature, the beauty of the island and everything, which is also solidified by two of the lead developers being appointed as tourism ambassadors to the actual real-life island of Tsushima. I enjoyed playing the game quite a lot, and I'm glad it finally came to PC so I could play it for myself. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. That might be a bit late on the topic, but that's kind of my shtick at this point, right? Hopefully, I'll see you again in the next video, which will be about another video game. Busy gaming time ahead for all. See you later. Peace out.
来世では誠の武人となれ。